Uncle, I know how to make your son walk again. The black beggar girl told the millionaire. The autumn wind rustled fallen leaves across the sidewalk as Lucas Bennett wheeled his 10-year-old son Mason through the park's back path, one he rarely took. Mason's legs, once so full of life, now lay limp beneath a navy blanket, the echo of a tragic accident that money hadn't fixed. Lucas's business empire could fund space missions, yet every expert gave him the same final verdict. Your son will never walk again. That sentence echoed in his head as a small, cracked voice broke the stillness behind him. Uncle, I know how to make your son walk again, said a tiny girl crouched beside the alley dumpster. Lucas turned with suspicion, expecting another vagrant or perhaps someone sent to scam him. But what he saw halted his breath. A young girl, barefoot, black, wearing a too large green sweater patched in odd places, stood confidently, her brown eyes shining with something that almost looked like certainty. Her hair was messy, her knees scraped, and yet she held herself like someone who carried secrets no one dared to ask about. What did you say? Lucas asked, gripping Mason's wheelchair tightly. I can help him, she repeated. But not me. My Nana can. She's waiting. Lucas felt his heartbeat pound. It sounded absurd, mad even. But Mason's soft voice cut through his skepticism. Dad, can we just try? Lucas knelt beside his son, brushing back a strand of blonde hair from his pale forehead. If you feel even the slightest bit scared, we leave. Promise me. Mason nodded. The girl smiled faintly, turned and motioned them to follow her down a winding alley. The sun faded fast as they trailed her through graffiti-tagged back streets and narrow paths littered with broken glass. Lucas was tense, pushing the wheelchair, over cracked pavement, eyeing every shadow, but the girl moved with ease, checking over her shoulder with a calmness that made no sense for her age. What's your name? He asked. Lena, she said softly. I've been waiting for you both. Mason looked up at his dad. She's not lying, is she? Lucas didn't answer. He didn't know how. They reached the edge of a narrow, dirt trail, hidden behind rusting fences and forgotten buildings, where the city noise melted into whispers of wind through trees. Lucas paused, eyeing the path suspiciously. But Lena didn't hesitate. She stepped into the shadows with the quiet grace of someone who'd walked that trail 100 times barefoot. Mason's fingers tightened around his father's wrist. Please, he whispered again, barely audible. That one word, please, carried more weight than any doctor's report ever had. Lucas exhaled, chest tight, and pushed forward. The trail twisted and turned, flanked by thick trees and soft earth damp from the morning rain. For the first time in years, Lucas wasn't thinking about business meetings or therapy schedules. He was thinking about this moment. About the strange calm that hung in the air, the girl leading them with a quiet kind of purpose, and Mason, his brave, broken boy, watching it all with wide, trusting eyes. Something about this place felt untouched, almost sacred. Lucas could feel it in his bones. A small wooden cabin appeared at the trail's end, smoke curling gently from a crooked chimney. Wind chimes made from old spoons and bottle caps sang in the breeze. She's in there, Lena said, pointing to the door. She doesn't charge money, just faith. Lucas hesitated, the weight of years of disappointment pressing on his shoulders. But Mason looked up at him, his voice firm now. I want to try, Dad. And in that moment, Lucas didn't see a broken boy. He saw a fighter. The old woman inside looked like time had woven her into the very wood of the house. She smiled as they entered, eyes warm and wide, like she had known them forever. So this is the boy, she said, reaching out a hand gnarled by age but steady. And the father, who carries the world on his back. Lucas blinked, startled. He hadn't said a word. Lena stood beside her, quiet and proud. Can you really help him? Lucas asked, voice cracking. I can't promise miracles, the woman said gently. But sometimes, what's broken needs more than fixing. It needs believing. The cabin was dimly lit, the glow of a few lanterns casting soft gold across the wooden walls and woven rugs. Mason sat on a cushion by the fireplace, his legs tucked carefully beneath him, watching the flames like they might whisper a secret. The old woman, who Lena simply called Grandma May, moved slowly, her steps light and deliberate, like she didn't want to disturb the quiet that had settled over them. Lucas sat across from her, every instinct in him twitching with doubt. But something about her presence made him still. She didn't ask Mason to explain what was wrong. She didn't touch his legs or inspect him like the doctors had. She just sat beside him and began to hum. A melody so soft, so old, it felt like it had been carried on wind through generations. Mason leaned into it, his eyes fluttering closed, a tear slipping quietly down his cheek. Lucas looked away, throat tightening, not from pain, but from the tenderness of it all. How long had it been since his son had felt peace? Grandma May spoke, but not to Mason. She spoke to Lucas, her voice like silk against worn nerves. When roots are hurt, they grow slow, but they still grow. Lucas didn't know what she meant, but he nodded, needing to believe something again. The girl, Lena, sat by the door, hugging her knees to her chest, her eyes never leaving Mason's face. There was something protective in the way she watched him, as if his pain was something she'd carried too. Maybe she had. The fire crackled, and a warm breeze rolled in through the cracked window, brushing against Mason's skin. He stirred slightly, his hands curling at his sides, not from discomfort, but as if feeling something long forgotten. "It tingles," he whispered, just loud enough for the room to hear. Lucas straightened, heart stuttering. Lena gasped. Grandma May only smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Then the roots remember?" she said softly. "That's a start." Lucas couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Mason's fingers twitching beside the fire. The way the boy whispered, "It tingles," like he'd just heard his own voice for the first time in years. He sat on the porch of Grandma May's cabin, staring out at the dark woods, tears drying on his cheeks as stars blinked above. Somewhere inside, Mason was sleeping peacefully. No pain, no fear, just quiet. The kind Lucas had begged for, night after night. The door creaked, and Lena stepped outside, wrapping a faded quilt around her thin shoulders. She didn't say anything at first, just stood beside him, looking out like she was guarding something sacred. "He'll walk," she said after a long silence, her voice gentle but sure. Grandma May doesn't heal with magic. She just reminds people what they forgot was possible. Lucas looked at her, eyes wide with disbelief, hope clawing at his chest like a wild animal that had been caged too long. "I don't know how to believe anymore," he whispered, ashamed. Lena shrugged softly, her eyes glistening. "You don't have to. He already does." She stepped back inside, leaving Lucas alone with the stars and a strange, warm ache in his chest. That night, for the first time in years, he prayed, not out of desperation, but out of gratitude. Not for what he'd lost, but for what might still be waiting. By morning, Mason was sitting up straighter. He laughed, actually laughed, when Grandma May told a story about a crow that stole her dentures. His legs still didn't move, but the light in his face did. And for Lucas, that light was more healing than any miracle. They stayed for 3 more days, and each night Mason whispered that the tingling had spread, ankle, knee, thigh. By the 4th morning, he stood. Wobbly, trembling, but standing, Lucas fell to his knees, arms wrapped around his son, weeping like a man reborn. Lena grinned through her own tears. Grandma May simply watched, nodding as if she'd known all along. "Some things," she said softly, only grow in the broken places. And as Mason took his first slow, shaky step toward his father, the forest behind them stood still, like even nature was holding its breath for a boy who just remembered how to rise. Lucas didn't tell many people what happened in the woods. Not because he was ashamed, but because most folks wouldn't believe it. How do you explain that your son, who hadn't moved his legs in 3 years, suddenly stood up behind a cabin owned by a barefoot girl and her half-blind grandmother? It didn't sound like science, it didn't sound like therapy, it sounded like something you read in a book, then dismiss as fiction. But Lucas had seen it. He'd held Mason's hands as the boy trembled and took those first fragile steps toward him. He didn't need the world to believe, he just needed Mason to keep walking. They came back to town quietly. No news vans, no parades, just a rusted sedan, a weary father, and a little boy with uncertain but working legs. Mason still needed support sometimes. His balance wasn't perfect, and his muscles were weak from years of disuse. But his spirit? That was iron. At the grocery store, when he reached for a box of cereal by himself, the cashier nearly dropped her scanner. "Is that Mason Reed?" she whispered, eyes wide. Lucas just smiled. "Yeah, he's working on walking again." People whispered. Some stared. A few offered quiet congratulations, but most just shook their heads, trying to fit it into something they understood. Lucas didn't try to explain. He only said the same line every time. Kindness did what medicine couldn't. It wasn't flashy, but it was true. That girl, Lena, she hadn't asked for anything. Not money, not fame, just trust. And somehow, in that crumbling cabin with no power, no internet, and only one working faucet, she'd given them something no hospital ever had: hope with roots. At home, Mason kept improving. He stumbled. He fell. He cried sometimes in frustration, but he always got back up. Lucas installed rails in the hallway and painted the living room a lighter color. "It's like a restart," Mason said one night, curling up beside his dad on the couch. "Like I was in a long, bad dream. And now I'm learning how to be awake again." Lucas swallowed hard. He didn't have words for that. Just wrapped his arm around his son and held him. Months later, Lucas drove back to that woods with a letter in hand. The cabin was gone, no sign of Lena, no sign of Grandma May. Just quiet trees and a patch of wildflowers growing where the porch once stood. He left the letter on a flat stone and whispered, "Thank you," before turning back to the car. Mason was waiting, legs dangling, shoes untied, grinning like the world had finally made sense again. The weeks that followed were quiet but powerful, like the slow rising of sunlight after a long, dark night. Mason didn't suddenly leap into perfect health. That's not how life works. But every day brought a tiny miracle. A step without help. A longer moment of balance. A staircase climbed with trembling determination. Lucas kept track of it all in a worn notebook. Dates, times, notes in the margins. Not because he needed proof, but because he couldn't let himself forget how far they'd come from that city sidewalk, and the girl with dirt on her hands and wisdom in her voice. Each morning began the same way now. Lucas would sit at the kitchen, table, coffee in hand, and listen to the soft thumps of Mason walking down the hallway. Some days the boy still needed a crutch. Other days he didn't. It didn't matter. What mattered was that sound. Those footsteps were a song Lucas thought he'd never hear again. He'd close his eyes, breathing in the moment, letting it fill the cracks inside him that years of guilt and helplessness had carved out. Sometimes Mason would ask questions about Lena. "Do you think she was an angel?" he'd say between bites of cereal. Lucas never knew how to answer. Angels, miracles, fate. They weren't things he'd ever put much faith in before. But after that day, after watching his son rise, barefoot and teary-eyed, into his arms, he wasn't so sure anymore. "I think," he would reply gently, "she was exactly who we needed." There were nights when Lucas dreamed of the woods again, of following Lena through the overgrown trail, pushing the wheelchair over roots and gravel, Mason's small voice asking, "Where are we going?" And Lena always looking back, smiling softly, her words etched into his heart like scripture. To somewhere that remembers how to heal. He would wake up in the stillness and just stare at the ceiling, replaying the memory again and again like a sacred film. And then one day, a letter came. No return address, just his name written in careful, looping letters. Inside was a photo. Mason standing on the porch of that cabin, smiling shyly with Lena beside him. On the back, scribbled in pencil, were 5 words. "Keep walking. You both earned it." Lucas held the photo against his chest, eyes wet, heart full, and for the first time in years, he believed in something bigger than pain, something gentler, something real. The seasons shifted quietly after that, spring pouring into summer with longer days, golden skies, and the sound of Mason's laughter filling corners of the house that had once echoed with silence. Lucas began fixing things. Not just the creaky porch steps or the gutters clogged from last fall, but himself, too. The bitterness that had worn him down started to melt away. He found himself smiling more, not out of habit, but because joy had returned to his life, slow and steady, like a river carving through stone. Mason joined a local soccer club, not to compete, but just to feel the grass beneath his feet again. His first time running across the field wasn't perfect. He stumbled, fell. But when he got back up and grinned through the dirt on his cheeks, Lucas clapped louder than anyone. Parents asked questions. Doctors remained baffled. But Lucas never tried to explain. Some things didn't need to be understood. They only needed to be honored. On a quiet Sunday morning, Lucas returned to that wooded trail alone. He carried nothing but a small bouquet of wildflowers he and Mason had picked together. The path felt different now, less eerie, more sacred. At the cabin's clearing, he paused. It was empty. No fire, no sign of Lena. Just a wind chime on the porch whispering a soft tune, as if the forest itself remembered her. He laid the flowers gently on the porch and stepped back. "Thank you," he whispered, voice steady, "for giving him back to me, for showing us both how to walk again." And then, for the first time in a long, long while, he turned and walked away, not with the heaviness of loss, but with the lightness of love. Back home, Mason stood at the window waiting. His crutch leaned against the wall. Lucas waved. Mason ran to meet him at the door, barefoot and smiling. And together, they stepped into whatever came next. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to smash that thumbs up and hit subscribe for more unforgettable, emotional, and viral true stories. We want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell us, where in the world are you watching from?